The pass at Thermopylae was so narrow that two carts could barely pass each other. On one side stood the cliffs, on the other, the sea. And in between, a small Greek force waited for the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. There were no speeches, no music, just the sound of armor, wind, and waves. Tonight, we are going to walk back into that moment. Not the version shaped by movies and legends, but the real story, shaped by politics, alliances, fear, and careful strategy. Who were the men who stood there? Why did they stay? And what did this battle actually change in the history of Greece and Persia? As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are drifting towards sleep or simply letting history wash over you, take a slow breath and let the story unfold. The order went out from Susa, and it moved across the empire faster than any marching army. Couriers rode hard along the royal road and down side routes that cut through valleys and across dry plateaus. They carried the same instruction in many languages. Governors were to send men, ships, food, animals, and metal. Storehouses were to be filled, bridges were to be planned. In the palaces of Persia, scribes wrote lists until their hands cramped. In the ports of Phoenicia, shipwrights shaped cedar and pine into hulls, and crews were pressed into service. In Egypt, grain and dried fish were measured and packed. In Babylon, officials counted livestock. The king wanted Greece, and the empire had the habit of obeying. Xerxes ruled a state built for large projects. His father Darius had expanded Persian power across Western Asia, and he had already tested Greece. That earlier clash ended with a Persian defeat at Marathon, the kind of defeat that stung because it came from people the empire counted as small. Darius died before he could return with a larger force. Xerxes inherited the throne and the unfinished work. He also inherited the court politics that came with it. Advisors and relatives argued around him. Some spoke for consolidation and order. Others pressed for conquest and punishment. The idea that a few Greek cities had fought back carried real consequences because it set an example for other provinces. Xerxes chose a campaign that would answer that resistance in a way the empire understood. He would bring an army so large that Greek alliances would break under the pressure. He would bring a fleet so strong that Greek coasts would be exposed. He would arrive with supplies and engineers, and he would make the march itself a demonstration of control. Preparation turned into a public show. Xerxes moved to inspect forces and confirm loyalty. Satraps came with gifts and promises. Commanders assembled units drawn from across a wide map. The variety alone made an impression. There were Persians and Medes. There were men from Bactria and Sogdiana, from India, from the Caspian regions. There were archers, spearmen, cavalry, and light troops used to rough ground. The navy gathered as well, and it came from places where ships were a daily tool. Phoenician cities supplied skilled sailors and strong ships. Egyptians brought their own vessels. Ionians and other Greeks under Persian rule came too, a reminder that the Aegean already had Persian reach. The scales strained every system that supported it. Water mattered as much as weapons. Grain mattered as much as armor. Animals had to be fed, and animals also had to pull wagons and carry loads. The campaign demanded roads that could take traffic, officers who could keep order, and disciplined schedules that prevented crowding at wells and harbors. The geography between Persia and Greece forced choices. A march overland required crossing the Hellespont, the narrow stretch of water between Asia and Europe. A fleet moving along the coast had to pass dangerous points where storms could break ships and drown crews. Xerxes wanted to solve these problems with engineering and planning, and he wanted the solutions to be visible. Work began on a canal across the isthmus of Mount Athos, a place where an earlier Persian expedition had lost ships in severe weather. Digging a canal took time and labor, and it required supervisors who could coordinate large groups of workers. It also sent a message that the king expected success and that he would reshape land to reduce risk. At the Hellespont, engineers prepared bridges made of boats lashed together, anchored against current and wind. Cables were stretched, planks were laid, protective barriers were built along the sides. The goal was a crossing that would allow men, horses, wagons, and supply trains to move as if the sea were a road. The first attempt at the bridge failed when storms tore it apart. The failure mattered because it threatened more than the schedule. It threatened the image Xerxes wanted. Repairs began quickly. New cables were used. Anchors were set with more care. The work proceeded under pressure, with the king watching the result closely. When the crossing was ready, the empire put on one of its largest public movements. Troops filed across in long lines. The weight of the army pressed boards and ropes. The sounds were practical: footfalls on wood, harness leather creaking, wheels on planks, shouted commands carried by wind. Animals balked and were pulled forward. Officers kept lines moving. The crossing took time because the numbers were immense and because supply wagons and animals slowed the pace. Ancient writers later offered enormous totals, and those totals became part of the legend. Modern estimates vary and tend to be smaller, yet every serious estimate still describes a force far beyond anything most Greek cities could field on their own. Xerxes had arranged that imbalance on purpose. Once in Europe, the army moved along a route that kept it close to water. The fleet provided support along the coast, carrying supplies and offering an alternative way to move heavy items. The march brought its own problems. Crowds of men and animals trampled fields and strained local resources. Wells ran low. Streams were disturbed by so many feet. Food had to be distributed in a way that prevented fighting within the ranks. The Persian system relied on organization. Depots were established. Local leaders were ordered to provide provisions. The army carried stores, yet it also depended on taking in supplies as it went. That dependence made the choice of route important. Xerxes aimed for a path where the land could support him and where the navy could keep pace. Each day of marching had to end with water and food. Each night had to hold order in a camp filled with voices from many regions. As Xerxes advanced, news traveled ahead of him. Greek observers heard reports that grew with each retelling. Some stories focused on numbers. Others focused on the king himself, describing his wealth and the splendor of his court. The effect was real, even when details were uncertain. Leaders in Greece understood that this was an invasion designed to overwhelm. Xerxes sought a decisive end to resistance. A single victory over scattered defenders would allow him to push deeper into Greece and force cities to submit one by one. He could accept surrender from some and punish others as examples. The campaign already carried that pattern because the empire often offered a choice between cooperation and destruction. Xerxes expected the same in Greece. His officers prepared for it. Diplomats and messengers moved alongside the military effort, carrying demands and testing loyalties. The march also had a personal dimension for Xerxes. He had chosen a path that would be judged by success or failure. An emperor could delegate many tasks, yet responsibility for a campaign of this scale stayed attached to his name. A defeat would echo through the empire. A victory would strengthen his authority at home and abroad. He had invested in engineers, in logistics, in a public display of strength. He had brought together subjects and allies and compelled them to move under one banner. Each mile west increased the cost of turning back because the campaign depended on momentum. When the army reached the staging areas in the western parts of the empire, the work shifted from preparation to execution. Units were positioned. The fleet coordinated with coastal movement. Scouts gathered information. Commanders discussed the terrain ahead. Greece lay across the water and beyond the mountain passes. Xerxes had chosen to meet it with volume, planning, and force, and the empire had responded to his call. Messengers reached the Greek mainland in dusty clothes and with hoarse voices. They came by ship into busy harbors, and then by foot or mule along rough roads, carrying the same core report with different details. Xerxes had crossed into Europe. The Persian army moved with engineers, wagons, and animals, and the fleet kept pace along the coast. In the cities of Greece, officials listened in public squares, in council chambers, and in the courtyards of temples where civic business often happened. The news created quick decisions. Some leaders sent riders to neighboring cities. Some ordered extra grain measured out from public stores. Some called up men of fighting age to drill with spear and shield. In places that had walls, masons inspected gates and repaired weak sections. In places that depended on ships, ship captains checked rigging and caulk, and they counted oars. Athens moved first on the water. The city had spent years arguing about its future, and the argument had produced timber, bronze, and hard work in shipyards. Themistocles, an Athenian politician with sharp instincts, had pushed for a strong fleet. He had convinced his fellow citizens to use silver from the mines at Laurion to build triremes, fast warships powered by 3 banks of oars. In the harbour at Piraeus, the result could be seen in rows of hulls pulled up onto slips, men sanding planks, carpenters fitting joints, and blacksmiths shaping metal fittings. Triremes demanded constant care. Oars had to be stored and kept straight. Rope had to stay dry. Sails had to be repaired. Crews had to practice until they could move as one unit. Themistocles understood that the Persian invasion would arrive by sea as well as land. The Persian fleet could land troops behind Greek defenses, raid coastlines, and cut off supplies. Athens had a tool to answer that threat, and the Athenians had the manpower to row if they could be organized and trained. In the months before the invasion, the city's poorer citizens found pride and purpose at the oar benches. Their labor gave Athens influence in Greek councils because ships mattered as much as hoplites. Sparta prepared on land with a different rhythm. Spartan society was built around training and discipline. Adult Spartan men lived in a system that required military readiness, and their daily life revolved around drills, communal meals, and strict expectations. They also lived under a calendar shaped by religious duties and civic law. That calendar mattered when the Persian threat grew close, because Sparta could not simply march whenever it pleased. Festivals and rituals set limits. The ephors, the elected officials who helped govern, received reports from scouts and allies. They weighed the danger against tradition and law. Spartan kings held authority in war, and one of them would lead any major expedition. The army itself was respected and feared across Greece, yet it moved according to decisions that could look slow from the outside. Sparta also managed a large population of helots, bound to the land and forced to work for Spartan households. That reality shaped Spartan policy. Every campaign had to consider security at home. Every march required planning that kept Sparta stable while the men were away. The Greek cities understood that no single polis could face Xerxes alone. Rivalries that had simmered for decades had to be set aside, at least long enough to resist the invasion. Representatives began to gather for talks. They met in places where travel was possible and where host cities could provide food and space for debate. A congress formed at Corinth where envoys could speak and where decisions could be recorded and carried back. The alliance that emerged placed Sparta in a leading role on land because Spartan hoplites had a reputation for discipline and battlefield cohesion. Athens held influence on sea strategy because it had invested heavily in ships and crews. Other cities brought their own strengths. Corinth had ships and sailors. Aegina had naval experience and a rivalry with Athens that had to be managed carefully. Megara controlled key passes near the isthmus. Cities in central Greece offered knowledge of terrain and local supply routes. Some regions hesitated. Some cities sent earth and water to Xerxes, the Persian symbols of submission. Their leaders calculated survival, local politics, and old grievances. Greek unity always carried friction, and this moment carried more of it, because fear sharpened every dispute. Decisions had to become plans. The Allied Council faced a blunt map. Xerxes could enter Greece from the north through Thessaly and then pass into central Greece. The Greeks needed a place where a smaller force could delay a larger one. They also needed the fleet positioned where it could prevent Persian ships from sailing around defensive lines. Geography offered an answer. Thermopylae was a narrow pass along the coast, squeezed between mountains and sea. The name came from hot springs in the area, and the ground itself forced an army into a confined path. It also lay near the sea routes that Persian ships would use to support the invasion. If Greek hoplites held Thermopylae, they could block the overland advance for a time. If the Greek fleet held the nearby straits at Artemisium, it could contest the Persian navy and prevent an easy landing behind the pass. The two positions formed a linked defense. If one failed quickly, the other became harder to hold. The council agreed on this paired strategy. Messages went out. Cities were told how many men and ships to provide. Commanders were assigned. Supply arrangements were discussed in practical terms. Grain shipments, water access, and the movement of pack animals mattered as much as spear points. Inside Athens, the plan required difficult choices. Many Athenians owned land outside the city walls, and war threatened farms and houses. The fleet's strategy demanded that the navy be ready to fight, and that meant pulling men into crews who might otherwise defend their own neighborhoods on land. The city held assemblies where free male citizens gathered and voted. Speakers argued about risk, about honor, and about survival. Orders were drafted. Some families moved valuables into safer storage. Ship crews were organized by tribe and neighborhood. Officers checked lists of names. Men who had never rowed before learned the movements in practice runs near the harbor. The rhythm of the oars, the calls of the boatswain, and the heat on the benches became part of daily life. Athenian soldiers drilled on land as well, yet everyone understood that the sea battle could decide whether Athens endured. In Sparta, the plan narrowed toward a single question: who would lead, and how many could go at once? Leonidas, one of Sparta's kings, carried military authority and the weight of tradition. He was older than the men who trained around him, hardened by years in the Spartan system. He would lead the initial force north. The number would be small at first, shaped by religious observances and the need to keep order at home. Yet the intent was clear. Sparta would send a king and a guard force to the pass as the alliance gathered its full strength. The decision carried danger. Everyone involved understood that the Persians would arrive with overwhelming numbers. A small force at Thermopylae would need discipline and allies, and it would need the terrain to work in its favor. While preparations continued, the Allied Council watched the clock. Each day Xerxes marched west, tightened the schedule for Greek assembly. The North Greek regions felt pressure first. Thessalian leaders weighed whether to resist or submit. Some asked the alliance for help. Some looked to their own survival and negotiated with Persia. The Allies needed the pass held long enough for Greek cities further south to organize defenses at the Isthmus of Corinth if required. Orders became urgent. Men began to travel to muster points with their armor and provisions. Farmers left fields at a critical time of year. Young men checked spear shafts and repaired straps on shields. Priests performed rituals and made offerings because divine favor mattered to these cities in practical ways. It shaped morale. It shaped whether leaders could justify a decision to their people. When the first Greek contingents began moving toward Thermopylae, their steps carried both planning and uncertainty, and the road north filled with the sound of sandals, cartwheels, and spoken names being counted. The path up to Delphi filled early, while the stone steps still held the night's coolness. Men arrived from different cities with dust on their sandals and bundles on their backs. They carried bronze coins for offerings, small statues, and bowls of oil. Some brought goats for sacrifice and led them carefully through the crowd. The sanctuary sat on the slope above the valley, with terraces and walls built to hold it in place. Priests in clean garments moved between altars and storerooms, checking supplies and preparing the rites. Smoke rose from burned fat and bits of meat, and the smell clung to clothing and hair. The people who came here spoke quietly once they passed the gate, because the place demanded restraint and because everyone watched who stepped forward. Spartan envoys reached the precinct with the same hard pace they used on roads. They carried the authority of their city and the urgency of the moment. The Persian army marched in Europe. The Greek alliance had chosen Thermopylae and Artemisium. Sparta had accepted command on land. The envoys followed the usual procedure. They paid the fee. They presented offerings. They waited their turn among other petitioners. The sanctuary worked like a system. Priests asked questions and listened for the words that shaped the request. The Spartans framed their question in practical terms. because they needed a decision that could be carried back to men who would vote and enforce it. They wanted the gods' guidance on war, on leadership, and on the fate of the city. Inside the temple, the process grew tighter and more controlled. Priests purified the space. Water was brought and used for ritual washing. Leaves of laurel were handled and prepared. The priestess of Apollo, the Pythia, entered the inner area where only a few could stand close. Her clothing and posture marked her role. The attendants guided her through the formal steps, and the priests kept order in the room. Outside, petitioners waited with tense faces, listening for any sign that their turn had come. A man could hear muffled voices, the scrape of sandals on stone, and the occasional sound of an animal bleating before sacrifice. The oracle had a reputation built over generations, and cities treated its words like official guidance. A choice made without consulting Delphi could bring political trouble at home, because opponents would question the leader's piety and judgment. The response that later writers recorded for Sparta carried a sharp edge. It spoke of a choice with two outcomes. One outcome meant Sparta's destruction, the other outcome meant the death of a Spartan king. The phrasing held the kind of force that leaders could repeat in public because it created a clear path of duty. A city could accept sacrifice or face ruin. A king could accept death or watch his people suffer under an enemy army. In Sparta, where obedience to law shaped public life, such words had practical power. They could be used to settle debate. They could be used to justify the order to march with a small force first, to hold a pass long enough for allies to assemble. They also placed a burden on the king who would lead, because everyone in the council would hear the same implication. The envoys carried the answer back south, across rough ground and through towns that watched them closely. In every city along the road, people were already counting days and measuring supplies. They spoke about the Persian numbers in the market and at fountains. They argued about which cities would fight and which would yield. When the Spartans returned home, they brought the oracle's words into a system of meetings and votes. The ephors convened. The council of elders met. Men listened while the envoys repeated the response in plain speech. Faces stayed controlled because Spartan custom demanded it. The reaction showed in smaller signs. A man pressed his lips together. Another stared at the floor. Someone tightened a grip on a walking staff. The leaders discussed what the answer meant in terms of action. Sparta had religious obligations already set in the calendar, including the Carneia festival. The Olympic Games were also approaching, and Greek states treated those events as binding. Sparta also needed to keep enough forces at home to manage the Helots and to protect the city from opportunistic rivals. Yet, the alliance needed a Spartan presence at Thermopylae quickly, because delay would open the road into central Greece. The oracle's message fit the direction Sparta was already leaning. It gave the decision a shape. Leonidas stood at the center of that decision. He was one of Sparta's kings, a man raised in the Spartan training system like any other Spartan male, because he had been far from the throne in his youth. He knew the discipline of communal life and the strict expectations placed on citizens. He knew the weight of public duty, because Sparta treated the king as a war leader under the oversight of the ephors. Leonidas listened to the report and watched the reactions of the men around him. He also understood the practical situation at Thermopylae. The pass could be held with a smaller force if the men were heavy infantry trained to fight in tight formation. The ground would reduce the Persian advantage in cavalry and numbers. Greek allies would join if Sparta showed leadership. The fleet would fight nearby, and the two efforts would support each other. A holding action could change the schedule of the whole campaign. The selection of the Spartan contingent carried its own rules. Leonidas chose 300 men from the citizen body, men in their prime who had proven themselves in training and in earlier service. Each man carried armor that belonged to his household and also belonged to the city in a symbolic sense. Bronze helmets were checked for fit. Breastplates or linen corselets were inspected. Greaves were strapped on. Round shields were cleaned and examined for cracks in the wood. Spear shafts were tested for straightness. Men carried short swords as backup, and they packed provisions in a simple way, because speed on the road mattered. Each Spartan was accompanied by helot attendants who carried gear and helped with camp tasks. Their presence was part of the logistics of any Spartan march. The men moved through the city and out onto the road with an orderly pace. Families watched from doorways and street corners. Spartan custom discouraged open displays, yet everyone understood the risk. A king marching north under a prophecy carried a clear expectation. The march began as a military movement and as a political statement. Other Greek cities would measure Sparta's commitment by what they saw. Allies would join more readily if a Spartan king led the advance. Rivals would calculate their own choices differently if Sparta acted first. Leonidas set the pace. The men walked in formation when the road allowed it, and broke into smaller groups when the terrain narrowed. They stopped at agreed points for water and food. They kept their weapons close. They avoided unnecessary talk because long marches punished careless energy. Along the way, they met contingents from other cities, men who had their own leaders and local pride. Some greeted the Spartans with relief. Some looked at them with caution because Spartan leadership came with authority. Leonidas accepted the allies and moved on toward the pass, with the oracle's words carried in memory by every man who had heard them spoken in the council. Leonidas kept the column moving before sunrise, when the road stayed firm and the heat came later. The Spartans carried their shields on the left arm and kept spears angled up to avoid striking the men ahead. Helot attendants walked with the packs and spare gear, watching straps and shifting loads when they began to rub. The pace was steady, set by the men in front and held by the men behind. Villages along the route did not see a grand parade. They saw tired faces, bronze glinting in brief flashes, and a line of disciplined men who did not break formation to stare or talk. At springs and wells, Leonidas allowed short stops. Water was drawn quickly, shared, and the column moved again. Orders were simple: keep spacing, keep weapons close, keep moving north. The 300 were not a random group. Sparta called them the Hippies, an elite guard chosen from the citizen body, and the title stayed even though they fought on foot. Their training showed in small habits. They checked the edge of a spearhead with a thumb. They adjusted a helmet cheekpiece without looking down. They tightened a grip on a shield strap and let the arm settle into the right position. Each man carried the equipment of a hoplite built for close fighting: a heavy round shield, a long spear, and a short sword for when the lines collapsed and the distance closed. Some wore bronze breastplates that had been passed down and repaired. Others wore linen armor, layered and stiffened, lighter for long marching. Their cloaks, practical for travel and cold nights, were rolled or draped depending on the weather. Leonidas watched them in motion. He knew what the pass demanded: a narrow front. Men who held their place, men who kept order when tired and hungry. The road north gathered people the way a river gathers streams. From nearby towns, small groups joined at junctions, each under its own officer. Some brought fewer men than promised because farms still needed hands and families feared leaving home exposed. Some brought more because their leaders wanted to show commitment to the alliance. Word spread ahead that a Spartan king was marching. That mattered. It pulled allies toward the plan and pushed fence-sitters into a decision. Local guides offered help where the terrain grew complicated. Pack animals arrived with dried food, onions, and cheese. Armorers in towns along the route hammered dents out of bronze. In the evenings, camp routines formed quickly. Fires were built in safe places. Spears were planted in the ground. Watch rotations were assigned. The Spartans ate simply and slept close to their shields. Leonidas kept talks with allied leaders short, focusing on where to meet and what to bring. The religious calendar still pressed on the decisions at home. Sparta's main army stayed back because the Carneia festival held them. Other Greek cities had their own obligations tied to the Olympic truce and seasonal rites. These constraints did not stop the invasion, and everyone knew it. They shaped the first response. Leonidas's force functioned as a commitment and a signal, a small, hard block placed early in the road. Later writers said Leonidas selected men who had living sons, so their family lines would continue. Whatever the details of selection, the result was clear on the march. These men expected danger. They had accepted it as part of the order. They spoke little about it. They focused on the next mile, the next water source, the next camp. When the column reached the region near Thermopylae, the ground and air changed. The coast lay close on one side, the mountains rose on the other, and the road narrowed into a passage that could be watched and defended. Hot springs gave off a sharp smell, and damp patches appeared where water seeped from the earth. The pass had more than one tight point, and the coastline shifted over time, yet its basic advantage remained the same: limited space for an attacker to deploy. Leonidas walked parts of it on foot, looking at the lines where men could stand shoulder to shoulder. He looked for firm ground where a hoplite could plant his feet and keep the shield walls steady. He looked for places where the enemy might try to climb around or slip through. The Spartans found an old wall built long before, a rough barrier of stone that had been damaged and neglected. They began repairs. Stones were lifted into place, gaps were filled. The work was slow and physical. It turned a landmark into a defense. Greek allies were already arriving or arrived soon after. The numbers grew beyond the 300. Men from Tegea and Mantinea came from Arcadia. Corinthians brought their own troops. Phocians arrived with knowledge of mountain paths. Thespians came with a decision that would later be remembered because they stayed. The total force at this stage stood in the thousands, not the tiny band that later retellings focus on. Command relationships had to be set. Leonidas held overall authority on land as the Spartan king, and allies accepted it because the alliance had agreed on Spartan leadership. Leaders from other cities still spoke for their men and watched their own interests. Leonidas addressed them directly, using clear instructions about where units would stand, how the line would be rotated, and what signals would be used. The plan relied on discipline and on the pass itself. If men held formation, the Persians would be forced into a narrow fight. The defense also depended on what happened at sea. News traveled that the Greek fleet was moving to Artemisium, the northern point of Euboea where the sea lanes narrowed and where ships could contest a larger force by limiting room to maneuver. The Athenian triremes and the ships of other cities would face Persian crews that had more vessels and more experienced sailors in some squadrons. The sea battle mattered here on land because Persian ships could land troops behind the pass if they gained control of the water. Leonidas knew that the wall and the shield line alone could not stop an enemy who arrived from the rear. He relied on coordination, on time, and on the assumption that the Phocians guarding the mountain path would do their job. He sent men to inspect that path and confirm its defense. The trail existed, and people in the region knew it. The question was whether the Persians would find it, and whether the guard force would hold it. The camp at Thermopylae settled into a tense routine. Men sharpened spear points with stones and checked the wood around their shield rims. They practiced moving forward and back in tight formation, keeping shields overlapping and spears angled over the front line. They rested when they could, because a battle could last days, and exhaustion could break a line faster than wounds. Scouts moved north to watch for Persian vanguards. Runners carried updates between the pass and nearby towns. Leonidas used the time to fix the line of defense and to set expectations. Hold the pass. Rotate tired men out. Keep order. Wait for the enemy. The road north stayed empty for stretches, then filled again with new arrivals and fresh reports. And each report tightened the sense that the main Persian force was close enough to be counted in days. The first Persian scouts appeared on the road in small groups, riding ahead of the main force and stopping often to look, listen, and measure distance. They wore light gear suited for travel and carried bows and short spears. They watched the pass from a safe distance at first, then came closer, trying to read the Greek line, the rebuilt wall, and the tight space between mountain and sea. Greek sentries stood at the wall with shields resting against their legs and spears held upright, eyes fixed forward. Behind them, men moved through camp with routine tasks, checking straps, grinding grain, fetching water, and carrying bundles of firewood. The camp stayed controlled. No one ran. No one shouted. When the scouts turned back, dust rose behind their horses, and that dust hung low over the road. The message went south to Xerxes. The pass was occupied. The Greeks had chosen to stand. Soon after, the Persian vanguard arrived in a long, steady flow. Infantry first, then cavalry, then more infantry, then supply wagons and animals. The road that had felt quiet for days turned into a moving line of people and equipment. At a distance, the Persian camp looked like organized labor more than a single mass. Tents went up in sections. Fires were lit for cooking. Units formed their own spaces. Officers moved between groups with assistants carrying tablets or writing materials. Food was distributed. Water was hauled in skins and jars. Horses were watered and checked for sores from the march. Guards were posted. The Persian army carried the habits of an empire that had moved large forces before. A soldier could see ethnic differences in clothing and weapons across the camp. Some men carried wicker shields and short spears. Others carried bows and quivers filled with arrows. Some wore scale armor that caught the light. Others wore felt caps and carried axes. The number of men extended beyond what any Greek camp had seen in one place. Ancient writers later reported very large totals. Modern estimates vary and often run lower, while still describing a force far larger than the defenders at Thermopylae. From the Greek position, the scale was visible in the length of the camp and in the constant movement on the road behind it. Xerxes arrived with his guard and took a position where he could observe the pass. He had made the march with planning and confidence, and he expected the Greeks to react the way many other communities had reacted when the empire arrived. He had already received submission from some Greek regions on the route. He had already seen cities choose safety. He also understood that the defenders at Thermopylae represented an alliance, and that the alliance depended on morale. A quick Greek collapse at the pass would ripple through the rest of Greece. Xerxes ordered his officers to make contact and bring back information. He asked questions about who led the defense and how many men stood there. He listened to reports that the Spartans were present and that a Spartan king commanded. He decided to wait. He waited for several days, expecting the defenders to leave once they saw the full Persian strength and the certainty of Persian victory. In the Greek camp, the waiting stretched the nerves. Men woke before sunrise, ate what they could, and took their assigned positions. They watched the Persian activity across the open ground. They saw horsemen riding along the front. They saw messengers moving between tent lines. They heard distant noise of construction, cooking, and animals. They did not have the luxury of stepping away from the wall. The pass demanded constant readiness. On the Persian side, the waiting had its own tension. A large army consumed supplies every day. Animals needed forage. Men needed food and water. The longer the pause, the more the campaign depended on steady logistics. Xerxes also had to consider the message he sent to his own troops. A king who paused too long in front of a small barrier risked questions about his judgment. He wanted the Greeks to surrender and save him the effort. He also wanted an outcome that looked decisive. When surrender did not come, he moved to demands. He sent a messenger to the Greek line under a flag of truce, with an interpreter as needed. The messenger approached carefully, staying within sight of Greek sentries and stopping at a distance that felt safe. Greek officers came forward to meet him. Leonidas stepped out with a small group of Spartans and allied leaders nearby, all armed, all alert. The Persian messenger delivered a demand for submission. The words carried the king's authority. Give earth and water, hand over weapons, accept the Persian king as master. The request framed the situation as a practical choice. Surrender meant survival and a place within the empire. Refusal meant destruction. Leonidas listened and answered without delay. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He spoke as a commander who had already accepted the reality of what stood in front of him. When the messenger demanded that the Greeks lay down their arms, Leonidas gave the response that later generations remembered: "Come and take them." The phrase carried the tone of a soldier speaking to another soldier. It also carried a simple fact. The Greeks held their weapons and their position. Any effort to remove them would require force in that narrow space. The messenger turned back and delivered the reply to Xerxes. The report hardened the situation. The defenders had chosen a fight. The Persian king shifted from waiting for surrender to planning an assault. In the Greek camp, the message moved quickly through the ranks, repeated in plain language from unit to unit. Some men grinned, some tightened their grip on spears, others stared ahead with steady faces. Leonidas ordered the line kept strong, and the wall manned at all times. Units rotated so men could rest and eat in short shifts. Allies who had never fought beside Spartans watched Spartan discipline up close. Spartans spoke little and corrected small errors in posture and spacing. Phocians remained assigned to the mountain path above the pass, with orders to stay alert and keep fires low at night. The sea stayed within sight from parts of the position, and men watched for signs of ships beyond the headlands, thinking about the fleet at Artemisium and the risk of Persian landings. Across the open ground, Persian soldiers began to move with more purpose. Officers gathered men and formed columns. Horns and shouted commands carried through the camp. The waiting was ending. The first day of battle was close enough to feel in the way men tightened straps, checked spearheads, and took their places along the narrow road. The first Persian assault began after the morning routines had already settled into place, with the sun climbing and the air warming the stones underfoot. Greek sentries watched a line form across the open ground, then a tighter column, then several columns as officers aligned men shoulder to shoulder and began pushing them forward. The front ranks carried shields made for speed and range rather than the heavy round shields of the hoplites. Many held short spears. Archers moved behind them with quivers full. The men advanced at a controlled pace, then faster as they reached the killing ground, the narrow mouth where the pass pinched down and the repaired wall marked the Greek position. Leonidas kept the Spartans in the line with allied hoplites arranged to fill the front, and he held reserves close enough to rotate in when arms grew tired. The Greek formation stayed tight. The front row locked shields rim to rim, spears angled forward in a dense line. The men stood close enough that the pressure of the line could be felt through the wood and bronze. The first clash came with a hard impact as Persian troops hit the spear points and shields. Greek spears drove into faces, throats, and chests, then pulled back and struck again. Some Persian soldiers fell immediately and created obstacles for those behind them. Others pushed forward until they met the wall of shields and the spear forest above it. Persian officers shouted orders and tried to force momentum, and the crowding made it hard for men in the rear to see what was happening. The narrow space turned the attack into a grind, with bodies packed close and the ground underfoot turning uneven as men stumbled over the fallen. Greek hoplites used the weight of their shields to shove and keep the front stable. The pass allowed only a limited number of attackers to engage at once. The rest waited behind, pressed into the mass, and their movement added pressure without adding fighting space. The Persians tried to use arrows, yet the angle and distance at the tight front reduced their effect. Some arrows found gaps and struck arms and faces. Most clattered against bronze or stuck into shields. The Greeks kept stepping forward in small synchronized pushes, then settling back into position. Their officers watched the line and called for changes. When a man in the front row tired, another stepped into his place. The formation remained steady. Xerxes watched the first waves fail. He had expected the defenders to break after a short, hard push, and he saw instead a line that held and a field that filled with his own dead. He sent in more troops. The next waves came with fresh men from units that had not yet fought, and they tried to find a weakness by changing the rhythm of the attack, pressing harder at certain points, trying to pull Greek shields aside with hooks or hands, trying to push the hoplites back from the wall and into looser ground. The Greeks responded with the same discipline. They fought at close distance. They kept the shield wall intact. A hoplite who lost his spear reached for a second, or drew his sword and stabbed in the crush when bodies pressed too close for spear work. Men on the edges of the line used the wall and the mountain slope to anchor their position. Allies from different cities fought with their own leaders nearby, and Leonidas moved along the line when he could, watching for breaks, speaking briefly to officers, making sure rotations happened before exhaustion caused mistakes. The Spartans in the front fought with controlled movements. They did not waste energy. They stepped forward, thrust, withdrew, and kept their shields high. As casualties mounted, Persian commanders brought forward more experienced troops and attempted a decisive push. The elite unit, often called the Immortals, entered the fight, identifiable by their equipment and by the way officers cleared a path for them. They advanced with confidence and tried to force their way through with concentrated effort, aiming to overwhelm the defenders at the narrowest point. Their spears and arrows had value in open ground, and their training suited many kinds of fighting. Here they faced a formation built for exactly this kind of contact. Greek spears reached them first. Greek shields absorbed impact. The Immortals pressed in and fought in the crush, and some reached the shield wall and struck at faces and arms. The Greeks answered by tightening the line and stepping in together, using the mass of the formation as a tool. Leonidas ordered short retreats at moments to draw attackers deeper into the narrow space, then a sudden forward push to trap them against the crowd behind. The maneuver created congestion in the Persian ranks and forced men to fight while jammed between bodies. The Greeks then rotated the front again, bringing fresh arms into the spear work. The Immortals took losses and failed to break the line. The fighting continued into the day, with repeated assaults that ended in the same result. Persian dead accumulated in front of the Greek position. Persian troops tried to pull bodies away to clear footing and open space for the next wave. Some fell while dragging. Others slipped on blood and uneven ground. Greek hoplites suffered fewer losses, yet the cost rose in bruises, cuts, and fatigue. Arms ached from holding heavy shields, throats burned from shouting and breathing hard. Some men fought with blood on their hands and forearms from close contact. When the pressure eased between waves, they drank from skins, spat dust from their mouths, and reset their grip on spears. Leonidas kept the order clear. Hold the front. Rotate frequently. Keep the line compact. The Phocians stayed on the mountain path above, out of sight from the main fighting, doing their own watch duty and listening to distant noise. They did not see any movement on the trail that day. The Greeks at the pass kept their attention forward, because every minute carried another push. By late afternoon, The Persian attacks slowed. Xerxes had burned through men and achieved no breakthrough. He pulled back his troops and let them regroup in the camp, leaving the ground in front of the pass covered with bodies and scattered equipment. In the Greek position, men stayed alert, expecting another sudden attempt. They cleaned spear points with cloth or scraped them on stone. They checked shield straps and replaced broken spear shafts with spares carried by attendants. Some moved the wounded to the rear, where allies and attendants applied bandages and tried to stop bleeding with pressure and cloth. The sun lowered. Shadows lengthened across the narrow road. Fires began in both camps as cooking started and wounded men were tended. Leonidas met briefly with allied leaders, keeping the discussion focused on practical issues. Water supplies, rotation schedules for the night watch, the condition of the wall, reports from scouts. The Greeks had held for a full day. They expected the next to bring the same pressure, and they prepared their bodies and gear for it. Dawn brought a hard reset. Men stepped over the same ground where bodies had fallen the day before, and the smell of sweat and smoke mixed with the sulfur from the springs. Greek soldiers stood at their stations while attendants moved behind them with water skins and bundles of food. Some of the wounded stayed in the rear with bandaged arms and faces. Others insisted on returning to the line and took a place where their injuries would not interfere with shield work. Leonidas walked the front in short passes, stopping to look at spearheads and shield rims, speaking a few words to officers, then moving on. The Spartans kept their usual habits even here. A few sat with combs and worked their hair back, keeping it neat before another day of fighting. Allied troops watched the gesture with a tight focus. It looked like routine. It also looked like confidence, because the men who did it remained in place and waited for the next assault. Across the open ground, the Persian camp came to life again with horns, shouted commands, and movement in ordered lines. Officers gathered units and pushed them forward in batches, keeping fresh men ready behind the first wave. Xerxes stayed close enough to see the mouth of the pass, and he expected results from the new plan. The first pushes came fast, with troops moving in a dense mass, trying to close the distance before the Greeks could settle their spear points. They reached the narrow front and slammed into the shield wall. The Greeks answered with a clean rhythm. Spears stabbed forward in short, controlled thrusts and pulled back just enough to reset. Shields rose and dipped to cover faces, then settled into overlapping rows. Men behind the front reached between shoulders to pass forward spare spears when shafts snapped. The Persians pressed hard and suffered the same problem as the day before. The pass limited how many could fight at once. The crowd behind pushed the front ranks forward whether they wanted it or not, and men in the front had little room to step aside or back away. Greek hoplites used the moment when pressure increased to shove forward together, opening space for spear work and forcing the attackers to stumble on uneven ground. Leonidas changed the pattern during the second day. He ordered units to step out from the wall and fight in the narrow road itself, then fall back in good order to reset. The move gave the Greeks a chance to clear bodies and broken shields that had collected at the front. It also forced the Persians to follow into a tighter space where their numbers crowded them again. The maneuver required discipline. The front rank stepped forward as one, shields locked, and the line moved several paces into the pass. Spears struck, then the men eased back in short steps, keeping their shields facing forward. When the line reached the wall again, fresh men rotated into place. The Persians tried to take advantage of movement and rushed forward, hoping to catch a gap. They met another wall of shields and another line of spear points. Persian archers shot into the mass when they could, and arrows struck bronze and wood with sharp sounds. Greek helmets turned some arrows, shields took others. A few arrows reached exposed flesh, and wounded men moved back while their neighbors stepped forward to fill the space. Xerxes committed stronger troops again and demanded a breakthrough. The Immortals returned to the front, with officers clearing a path, and they tried to force the line with concentrated pushes at a narrow point. Their men carried better equipment and followed tighter commands than many of the earlier waves. They pushed into the Greek spears and used their own short weapons in the crush. Greek hoplites answered with the same tools as before. Shields shoved, spears stabbed. Swords came out when the distance collapsed. The Greeks held their line and used quick rotations to keep arms fresh. Some Persians reached close enough to grab at shields and spear shafts, and Greek soldiers struck hands and faces at that range. Bodies fell and blocked the feet of those behind. The crowding grew worse. A few Persian troops tried climbing around the edge where the terrain rose toward the mountain, and Greek soldiers met them there with spears angled up the slope. The pass left little room for surprises. Every attempt turned into the same short, brutal contact. By midday, the fighting had the look of work repeated under pressure. Men fought, pulled back, drank, and fought again. Greek officers watched for signs of fatigue and moved tired men to the rear before their arms failed. Persian officers did the same, sending new units forward in sequence, trying to keep momentum alive. Xerxes watched repeated failures and adjusted with brute persistence. The Greek lines stayed coherent. The Allies held their positions and followed Spartan pacing because the pass punished any unit that broke order. Toward the end of the day, the Persians withdrew again to reorganize. The Greeks stayed at the wall, breathing hard, hands cramped around spear shafts, faces streaked with sweat and dust. In the rear, attendants carried water and pressed cloth against cuts. Men ate quickly and sat with their backs against stone, resting their legs without letting their weapons out of reach. Scouts moved along the mountain slopes and checked the higher ground. The Phocians on the upper trail remained at their posts, watching the path that curved through trees and rock above the pass. The Greek camp settled into another night routine with guards posted and rotations set, while both sides prepared for whatever the next day would bring. A man arrived at the Persian camp after dusk, walking with the cautious pace of someone who expected to be stopped. Guards challenged him and brought him forward through rows of tents lit by small fires. He smelled of smoke and travel, and his clothes carried the dirt of the local roads. His name was Ephialtes, a man from the region around Trachis, close enough to Thermopylae that he knew the slopes and side paths that locals used for herding and travel. He spoke to Persian officers through interpreters and made his offer in clear terms. A path ran over the mountains and came down behind the Greek position. A force could use it to reach the rear of the pass. Xerxes had already spent 2 days watching waves of men fail in the narrow front, and he had watched the Greeks rotate their line and keep discipline. This offer gave him a way around that wall of shields. Ephialtes wanted payment and favor. Persian officers listened, asked questions, and tested his knowledge by making him describe turns, landmarks, and distances. He answered with details that matched what scouts already suspected. The trail existed. The Greeks had placed guards there. The guards were Phocians, not Spartans. Xerxes accepted the deal and ordered preparations at once. The selected Persian force assembled in darkness with minimal noise. Officers moved along ranks and counted men by units. Some carried spears, others bows. A detachment under a trusted commander formed near the edge of camp where the ground rose toward the foothills. The men carried light gear for movement on steep terrain, and they brought guides who knew the start of the trail. Ephialtes took his place at the front with a few Persian guards around him. He knew the risk of leading an army into the hills, and he also knew the reward promised by the king. The group left the main camp and moved into the shadowed slopes. The route climbed through uneven ground with loose stones that shifted under sandals. Trees stood close in some places, forcing the column into single file. In other places, the trail widened briefly, enough for men to step aside and let officers pass. The Persians moved with steady discipline, using quiet commands and hand signals. They carried water skins and kept their weapons ready, because they expected contact with the Greek guards at some point. The men kept their spacing tight enough to avoid losing the trail and wide enough to avoid tripping over each other on steep turns. Near the top, the Phocian guards held a position that made sense for their task. They watched the trail and listened for movement, and they kept a small camp with limited fires. Their duty was to block the very route Ephialtes now led the Persians along. Some dozed in short shifts. Others stood and listened, spears in hand. They heard the first signs as faint sounds of feet on rock and the soft clink of gear. The Phocians raised an alarm and gathered in formation with hurried movements. Persian troops advanced through the trees and met them at close range. Arrows flew first, then spears and short weapons came into use as both sides closed. The Phocians fought long enough to make a decision. Their position sat near higher ground, and they pulled back to a more defensible point above the trail, expecting the Persians to press upward toward them. The Persians had a different goal. They wanted the route behind Thermopylae, and their orders demanded speed. They left a portion of men to keep the Phocians contained and continued along the trail with the main body. The Phocians watched them pass below and saw the columns stretch through the trees. They understood what the movement meant. The Persians had slipped past their guard. A runner left at once, moving downhill as fast as the terrain allowed, aiming for the Greek camp at the pass. Before dawn, the Persian detachment reached the descending side of the mountains and began moving down toward the road behind the Greeks. The terrain shifted. The slope changed angle. The trees thinned in places and opened into patches where the moonlight showed the line of helmets and spear shafts. Ephialtes guided them to the correct turns, and officers kept the men moving even when legs cramped from the climb. Down at Thermopylae, the Greek camp held its night routine with guards posted and men sleeping in short, uneasy blocks. The pass itself stayed quiet compared to the day's fighting, yet the defenders kept their formation plans ready for morning. Some men slept with shields beside them and spears within reach. Others sat with backs against the wall, and closed their eyes for minutes at a time. Leonidas remained close to the front, awake for long stretches, listening to reports from sentries. At some point in the night, a message reached him from scouts or from the Phocian runner, carried hand to hand through the dark. The report spoke in direct terms. Persian troops moved along the mountain path. The enemy aimed to reach the rear. The plan at Thermopylae had depended on holding the narrow front, and this report changed the shape of the fight. As the sky began to lighten, Leonidas called allied leaders together near the wall, close enough that men could still hear commands and move quickly if the Persians attacked again at the front. Officers arrived from different contingents with faces drawn from lack of sleep. They listened while the report was repeated. The information left little room for argument. A Persian force approached from behind. The Greek position would soon face pressure from both directions. Leonidas asked for updates. How far had the Persians come? How many? Whether any of the mountain guards had held the trail. Messages came in fragments because runners arrived at different times and each man carried only what he had seen. The one shared point remained consistent. The Persians had passed the upper guard and continued toward the rear of the pass. Men began to adjust their gear in preparation for movement. Some tightened straps and checked spear shafts. Others drank water quickly and swallowed a few mouthfuls of food. The mood stayed controlled, shaped by training and by the presence of officers who demanded order. The decisions that followed would determine which units withdrew and which held, and the first hints of that choice began to form in the tight group near the wall, while the daylight grew stronger over the mountains. Leonidas gave orders before the sun cleared the ridge. Men were shaken awake in small groups. Armor was pulled on in the half-light. Shields were lifted and strapped. Spears were checked for cracks in the wood and straightness of the point. Officers gathered their captains near the wall, close enough that sentries could still watch the Persian camp at the front. The report from the mountain path was repeated again, slower this time, so no one could pretend they misunderstood. A Persian detachment had crossed the heights and was moving down behind them. The pass would soon have enemy troops at both ends. Leonidas listened to each allied leader in turn and kept the discussion narrow. He asked for numbers of men ready to move, for the condition of the wounded, for how fast each unit could march, and for which roads could carry them south. The Allied leaders argued about duty and risk in practical terms. Some wanted to stay because retreat under pressure could turn into a slaughter on the road. Some wanted to leave at once while there was still time. Some asked for a chance to fight another day in another place, because their cities needed men alive for the battles that would follow. Leonidas made a clear choice and spoke it as an order. Most of the Allied contingents would withdraw while there was still a route open. Runners were sent to units with instructions spoken in direct language. Pack up, move fast, keep formation on the road. Do not stop for loot. Do not stop to argue. A rear guard would remain to hold the front long enough for the withdrawal to happen. Men who were leaving began moving at once. Some rolled up blankets and tied them with rope. Some strapped on helmets and carried shields on their backs to free hands for packing. Attendants gathered cooking pots and water skins. The sound in the Greek camp changed from the quiet of watch duty to the scrape of gear on stone and the low voices of officers pushing men into motion. The withdrawal did not look like panic. It looked like a hard, organized movement under time pressure. Units formed lines and filed out of the position in sequence so they would not block the road. Men carried wounded comrades on shields or supported them under the arms. Officers walked alongside and kept the pace steady. The narrow pass that had served as protection now threatened to become a trap if the rear was cut off. Leonidas kept men at the wall and at the tight point of the road to prevent a sudden Persian rush from breaking into the moving column. Small groups of Spartans stepped into gaps and held steady while allied units passed behind them. The defenders who remained stayed focused on the front and on the rear at the same time because the moment demanded it. Scouts moved along the side paths to watch for the Persian detachment coming down from the mountains. They returned with short reports. The enemy was close. The enemy was moving quickly. The enemy would reach the road behind them soon. Some allies chose to stay with Leonidas. The Thespians made that choice in a direct way. Their leaders spoke with Leonidas and then with their own men, and the men did not leave with the withdrawing column. They tightened straps and took places in the line. Their city did not have the same military system as Sparta, yet their decision was concrete and visible. They stayed in the pass with weapons in hand. The Spartans remained as well, because Leonidas did not order them to withdraw, and because the Spartan order had begun with the expectation of sacrifice. Each Spartan knew what the oracle had said. Each Spartan had marched north with that knowledge, and the presence of the Persian detachment behind them made the outcome immediate. The Thebans also remained in the pass. Their presence carried its own tension, because Thebes had a complicated position in the alliance, and its leaders had dealt with Persia in ways that made other Greeks suspicious. Leonidas kept them within the remaining force and placed them where they could be watched. Officers spoke to them in blunt terms about holding their place. The arrangement reduced the chance of confusion or desertion in the moment when every man in the line mattered. As the light grew stronger, the Persians at the front began to form again for another assault. They could see movement in the Greek position and likely sensed a change. Xerxes had received word that his detachment was moving into position behind the Greeks, and he expected the trap to close. The Greek line at the wall stayed in place. Fewer men than the day before, yet still in tight formation. Leonidas shifted the defenders back from the wall to a position that gave them room to maneuver and let them avoid being pinned against stone from both sides. Men stepped to new points along the road as officers guided them, and they formed a compact block with Spartans and Thespians mixed in places, keeping shields overlapping and spear points aligned. The ground behind them rose slightly in a way that offered a small defensive advantage. They chose it because it limited how easily the Persians could surround them in the first moments. The first Persian push of the morning hit the Greek line with a new confidence. The attackers came in a dense mass, aiming to crush what looked like a reduced defense. Greek spears met them at the narrowest point, and the first ranks fell as they had before. The Greeks fought with the same discipline, yet the situation had changed. The defenders could hear noise from the rear now, distant at first and then clearer, the sounds of movement in the trees and on the slope where the mountain path came down. A few Greeks turned their heads and caught glimpses of helmets and spear shafts behind them. Officers forced faces forward again with shouted commands, because a turned head meant an exposed neck and a broken line. The Spartans kept their formation and used short, coordinated pushes to drive attackers back, buying minutes. The Thespians held close, matching the movement and keeping shields locked. The line could not extend. The line could only stay tight and fight in place. As the rear threat grew closer, Leonidas moved along the inside of the formation where men could make space for him, speaking briefly to officers. He pointed at positions where men should stand and where reserves should be held. He ordered the wounded who could still hold a shield to take places where the press would be less intense. He ordered attendants and non-combatants to withdraw with the departing allies if they still had time. Some left at once, running low and fast along the road. Others stayed close, frozen by the speed of events, until an officer grabbed an arm and pushed them toward the exit. The Persian pressure at the front increased, and the Greek bloc responded with the last of its organized rotations. Fresh arms stepped into the front where they could. Men with broken spears drew swords. The sound of metal striking metal came closer. The press of bodies became tighter. The Persian detachment from the mountain path reached the road behind the Greeks in the same morning light. Greek sentries at the rear engaged them first and then fell back into the main group. The trap had closed. The defenders now faced two directions of attack in a space that offered little room for movement. Leonidas kept the remaining men together and prepared for a fight that would last until the formation broke and the survivors were cut down where they stood. The fighting tightened as soon as the Persian detachment reached the road behind the Greeks. Men who had spent 2 days facing north turned their bodies and shields in short, controlled steps to meet strikes from the rear, then turned back again when the pressure at the front surged. Officers shouted simple commands that carried over the clash. Hold the line, close the gaps, keep shields together. The defenders stayed packed close. Spartans and Thespians and others pressed into a single block because any split would become a break. Persian troops at the front pushed forward in fresh waves, and the troops at the rear began closing in, trying to squeeze the Greeks from both sides. The ground underfoot shifted with each shove. Broken spears and arrow shafts lay scattered and snapped under sandals. Bodies created uneven footing. Men stumbled and caught themselves on shield rims. The Greeks continued to work their spears in the few inches of space they could gain, thrusting toward faces and throats and pulling back fast to avoid having the spear shaft grabbed. Leonidas moved near the center where the formation held strongest, keeping enough guards around him to prevent a sudden rush from reaching him too easily. He watched the rear pressure grow and understood the time left in minutes rather than hours. He gave a clear order to advance. The remaining hoplites stepped forward together toward the wider ground in front of the wall, where they could fight without being pinned against stone and where the press at the rear would take longer to reach them. The move required discipline under contact. Men in the front row shoved forward with shields while men behind pressed in to keep the block tight. Spears rose and fell. Persian troops tried to hook shields and pull them aside. Greek swords came out when spear shafts broke. A Spartan with a snapped spear used the jagged end for a final jab, then dropped it and drew his sword. Another man took a spear from an attendant who pushed it forward through the ranks, then worked it until the shaft cracked again. The defenders advanced a few paces at a time, cutting down the men in front of them and forcing the Persian front to give ground in short, uneven retreats. The Persians recognized Leonidas by his position and by the bodyguard around him. Their officers pushed men toward the center. Arrows flew into the Greek mass from the rear and from flanks where archers found an angle. Some arrows struck helmets and glanced away, some struck exposed parts of the body. Greek shields lifted higher to cover faces, then dipped again for the shove. The press grew violent. A Persian soldier reached the Greek line with a short weapon and struck at a Spartan's throat. The Spartan caught the blow on the rim of his shield, then stabbed with his sword into the attacker's chest. Another Persian grabbed a Greek spear shaft and tried to wrench it sideways. The Greek holding it stepped in, drove the spear forward with both hands, and let the shaft slide free. In the crush, men fought with whatever part of their weapon could reach: a sword point, a spear butt, a shield edge. Leonidas stayed in the center of it, and eventually a strike found him. Accounts differ on the exact moment and weapon, yet the result was clear on the ground. Leonidas fell among his men during the final fighting, and the Spartans around him reacted immediately. The Spartans and Thespians surged toward the place where Leonidas went down and formed a protective ring with shields pressed tight. They fought with a new urgency, trying to keep Persian hands and blades away from the body. Men in the front took blows on shields and helmets, while men behind reached over shoulders with swords and short stabbing spears. Persian troops pushed in and tried to drag the body away as a trophy. Greek soldiers struck their arms and hands and forced them back. The struggle over Leonidas happened at close distance. Faces were inches apart. Men shouted in different languages and could smell sweat and blood. A Spartan lost his helmet and fought bareheaded for a few moments until a blade struck him and he fell. A Thespian stepped into the space without hesitation and raised his shield to cover the man next to him. The Greek ring held long enough to pull Leonidas's body back into the block, and then the defenders began moving again, because the rear pressure continued to grow and because arrows kept falling into the packed formation. The Greeks withdrew in short steps toward a small rise behind the wall, a place where they could hold a tighter perimeter. The movement was heavy and uneven, and it happened under constant attack. Men carried wounded comrades by the shoulders for a few steps, then had to let them down when the press became too strong. Some wounded men sat against rocks with their shields in front of them and waited for the next rush. The Thebans, trapped within the remaining force, reached a point where their officers made their own choice. Some of them began to move away from the Greek block with hands raised, trying to surrender to the Persians. The Persians took them out of the immediate crush and separated them from the rest. The Spartans and Thespians stayed together and kept moving toward the rise. Once there, they formed a rough circle, shields overlapping as much as the terrain allowed, spears angled outward. The circle held for a short time. Persian infantry pressed in from all sides, trying to break the formation by sheer force. The Greeks answered with stabbing spears and sword work, and the fighting turned into a series of short, brutal contacts around the perimeter. As more Greek spears broke, and as more men fell, the Persians changed the way they finished the fight. Archers stepped closer and shot into the circle at high frequency. Arrows struck shoulders, thighs, faces, and necks. Some men fell backward into the group and created gaps. Others stayed on their feet for a few seconds longer, swaying with their shields still raised, then collapsed. Persian infantry rushed in when they saw openings and used spears and short weapons to strike the fallen and the men trying to hold the last line. The Greeks fought until their arms failed and their bodies gave out from wounds. The perimeter shrank as bodies piled, and as the remaining men were forced into a tighter cluster. The last defenders stood on the rise with broken spear shafts in their hands or swords held close to their bodies, pushing back attackers at arm's length until they were struck down. The road behind them, the pass, and the wall were finally in Persian hands, and the dead lay where they had fallen. The Persians moved into the pass in full control before the day had fully turned. Infantry spread out first, stepping carefully over broken weapons and bodies. Then officers followed with guards at their sides. Some men carried spades and picks. Others carried ropes. A few walked with tablets and writing tools, looking at units and signaling for counts. The ground near the wall and the small rise held the densest pile of dead, Greeks and Persians mixed together in tight spaces where the fighting had ended at arm's length. Persian soldiers searched among the bodies for living men, turning them with the toe of a boot, watching for a hand that moved or a breath that fogged the air close to the mouth. They found a few wounded who had been missed in the final crush. Those men were taken away under guard. Most of the defenders lay where they had fallen, with shields cracked, spear shafts snapped, and arrows still lodged in wood and flesh. Xerxes came forward to see the place that had held him for days. He saw the narrow road and the wall and the ground littered with the remains of his own troops, and he saw the bodies of the defenders who had stayed. His officers pointed out the positions where the line had held and where the final perimeter had formed. They showed him where the Spartans had fought, where the Thespians had stood, and where the last resistance had collapsed under arrows and close pressure. The king had achieved what he needed in practical terms. The road south was open. The main army could march again. Yet the cost had been visible and the delay had been real, and it had happened against a small force compared to the size of his army. He responded the way an imperial commander often responded when resistance embarrassed him. He made an example. Orders went out regarding Leonidas. Persian troops located the body among the dead and brought it out under guard. Some accounts say the body was treated with deliberate insult. The head was taken. The body was displayed in a way meant to warn other Greeks about what happened when a king challenged Persia in the open. Persian soldiers did this work with the same practical manner they used for other tasks, carrying the remains, setting the display, then stepping back while officers checked the result. The Persian army also had to deal with its own losses. Men were assigned to gather the dead and the wounded and to clear the road. Wounded Persians were carried back to the camp on stretchers or supported under the arms. Surgeons and attendants cleaned cuts, pulled arrowheads, and tied bandages. Some wounded men died in the hours after the fight, and their bodies were added to the piles to be burned or buried. The clearing work continued for most of the day. Spears and shields that could be reused were collected. Armor was stripped from bodies and sorted. In some cases, soldiers fought over valuable pieces and had to be pushed back into order by officers. The pass had to become a road again, because a massive army could not move through a field of bodies and broken gear. By evening, the worst of the debris had been moved aside, and the Persian forces began to flow south. First scouts and cavalry, then larger bodies of infantry, then the supply lines and wagons that made the invasion possible. South of the pass, the Greek withdrawal continued under hard pressure and little rest. The men who had left on Leonidas's order marched fast, keeping formation when the road allowed it and breaking into smaller groups where terrain narrowed. Some turned their heads and listened for pursuit. Some looked down and focused on footing because a fall could break an ankle and leave a man behind. Officers kept the pace with shouted commands and hand signals. The wounded who could not keep up were carried for as long as strength allowed. Some were left with water and a weapon because the road could not stop without risking the whole column. News traveled through the marching ranks in fragments. Leonidas had fallen, the pass had been taken, the last defenders had fought to the end. Men repeated these lines in low voices while they walked, and each repetition carried the same practical meaning. The Persians were coming south. Runners went ahead to carry the news to Allied leaders. They reached towns and camps where men were still organizing defenses. They found councils in the middle of arguments about where to fight next and how many troops could be spared for each position. The report from Thermopylae forced decisions. Units that had planned to join the defense at the pass shifted their routes toward new muster points. Some leaders ordered men to fall back toward the Isthmus of Corinth, where a defensive line could block the land route into the Peloponnese. Other leaders focused on protecting their own cities and gathering their families and supplies behind walls. Messages reached Athens with the same grim clarity. The land road into central Greece lay open. Athens faced the Persian army without the shield of a northern pass. The city's leaders had already debated evacuation, and the defeat at Thermopylae turned debate into action. Officials prepared to move non-combatants towards safer places, including islands and the Peloponnese. Families packed what they could carry. Priests secured temple valuables. Citizens looked at the stone buildings of their city and understood that the walls alone would not stop an army of that size. At sea, the Greek fleet near Artemisium faced its own turning point. The naval commanders had fought the Persian fleet in a difficult set of engagements, with storms and shifting winds complicating movement, and with the coastline limiting safe space for repairs. The Greek ships had taken damage and suffered losses, and the Persian fleet had also lost ships in storms and in battle. The key fact remained the same. Thermopylae was gone. Without a Greek army holding the pass, the fleet at Artemisium risked being trapped or bypassed. Signals and messengers brought the news north to the ships, and the commanders called their captains together. They discussed anchors, rowing strength, and the condition of hulls. The decision followed quickly. The fleet would withdraw south to a position where it could continue to block Persian movement and protect evacuations. Crews moved fast, oars were set, sails were managed where wind allowed it. The ships left in formation as much as they could, with damaged vessels given protection by those still strong enough to fight. Xerxes pressed his advantage as his army advanced into central Greece. The road ran through towns that had already emptied or submitted. Persian scouts moved ahead and took control of key points. Cavalry searched side roads and fields for stragglers and for supplies. The main army followed, steady and heavy, carrying its own food and taking more from the land when it could. The scale of the movement made it impossible to hide. Dust rose over the columns. Animals and men consumed water sources quickly. Officers sent orders to keep the march organized, and to prevent units from breaking off for private plunder that would slow the advance. Every day gained increased the chance of catching Greek defenders before they could finish building works or concentrate forces. Greek leaders watched the movement through scattered reports and made hard choices about where to stand, where to retreat, and what they could afford to sacrifice to keep the war going. Athens moved on the order to leave, while there was still time to move families and supplies. Word spread street by street and house by house, carried by officials and neighbors who repeated the same instructions. Women packed clay jars with oil and dried food. Men lifted small children onto shoulders and carried bundles tied in cloth. Older people who could still walk leaned on sticks and moved with help from relatives. In the agora, people gathered around public notices and listened to the latest announcements. Some citizens argued in tight circles, voices rising and then dropping when a magistrate passed. Others moved without speaking, focused on getting out of the city before Persian cavalry arrived. In the harbour at Piraeus, ships loaded passengers instead of cargo. Crews pulled boats close to the piers, and people stepped down carefully with their bundles, trying to find space along the deck without blocking the oars. The triremes had priorities. They needed room for equipment and for crews. Civilian transport ships and smaller boats took many of the evacuees, and island communities received them with hurried preparations, bringing water, blankets, and basic food to crowded shorelines. Some Athenians went to Salamis, others went to Aegina, many went to Troezen and other places in the Peloponnese. The streets of Athens emptied unevenly, with some homes locked and abandoned, and some still occupied by those who refused to leave or could not move fast enough. The Greek leadership argued again, this time with less room for delay. Many Peloponnesians wanted a firm land defense at the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow neck of land that could block an army from entering the Peloponnese. Workers were sent to dig and build fortifications, hauling stones and timber into rough walls and ditches. Spartan and allied commanders inspected the line and directed where men should stand if the Persians reached it. The plan protected the Peloponnese. It also left Attica and Athens exposed. Themistocles pushed the fleet as the main tool for the next stage of the war. He pressed for a naval fight in waters that would limit Persian numbers, the same logic that had made Thermopylae useful on land. Captains and admirals gathered on the shore near the assembled ships and listened while arguments went back and forth. Some leaders wanted to pull the fleet south toward the isthmus, keeping it close to the land defenses and close to home cities. Themistocles insisted on fighting near Salamis, where the straits could limit maneuvering and where the Greeks could protect the evacuation routes. The debate grew sharp because each leader carried responsibility for his own city, his own crews, and his own survival. Decisions meant risk measured in wrecked ships, drowned sailors, and captured families. While the Greeks argued and moved, Xerxes advanced into Attica with the full weight of his campaign. Persian scouts rode ahead and marked routes for the main columns. Infantry followed in organized segments, and supply lines came behind with wagons and pack animals. The Persians entered Athens and found a city that had already sent most of its people away. They moved through streets that held more abandoned belongings than living voices. Some Athenians remained on the Acropolis, refusing to leave the sacred hill and trusting in its walls and shrines. Persian troops surrounded the height, and brought forward archers and siege methods suited to the terrain. The defenders threw stones and shot arrows from above. Persians used fire and forced entry after intense pressure, and the last defenders were killed or captured. Xerxes ordered punishment that carried a clear meaning. Buildings burned, temples were damaged. Smoke rose above the city and could be seen from ships and from the island of Salamis. Greek sailors and refugees watched it from the water, gripping the railings and pointing, each person recognizing familiar rooflines and landmarks through the haze. The destruction did not end the war. It removed a city from the land map for the moment, and it pushed the Greek fleet into a position where its next action would decide whether the Persian army could be supplied and moved with ease. The Greek fleet gathered near Salamis in crowded waters. Triremes anchored close together and crews slept on decks or on shore when there was space. The men ate small rations, cleaned hulls, and repaired damage from earlier fighting. Captains walked along the line of ships and inspected oars, checking for cracks and weak spots where an oar might snap under strain. Sailors sharpened small knives and tied spare rope into coils. Hoplites assigned to fight aboard ships checked their helmets and shields and practiced stepping from deck to deck without slipping. The atmosphere carried fatigue from days of movement and fear from the sight of burning Athens. It also carried discipline because the men understood what a battle in a narrow channel required. Themistocles moved between leaders and spoke in direct terms about position, timing, and the need to hold steady. He also worked the political problem that threatened to break the fleet apart. Several commanders still wanted to move south. Some feared being trapped in the Salamis Straits. Others feared leaving their cities exposed. Meetings ran late into the night, with torches burning low and men rubbing their eyes as they listened. Themistocles used every tool he had, including deception, to force a fight in the waters he believed favored the Greeks. He sent a trusted messenger to Xerxes with a message crafted to provoke action. The message claimed division among the Greeks and suggested that the fleet might slip away if the Persians waited. Persian commanders already wanted a decisive naval battle that would wipe out Greek resistance and secure supply routes. Xerxes also wanted a visible victory after the delay at Thermopylae, and after the storms and losses his fleet had suffered along the coast. Persian ships moved to block exits and to pressure the Greek fleet into battle. Through the night, Persian squadrons took positions at the mouths of the straits, rowing in tight groups guided by shouted commands and signal lights. Greek lookouts saw the movement and reported it along the line. The Greek commanders faced a situation where retreat became harder by the hour. Some leaders who had argued for withdrawal now had to accept the position. Orders went out along the Greek ships. Crews were woken. Oarsmen took their benches. Marines took their places on deck with helmets on and shields ready. The water around the ships filled with the sounds of wood against wood, the splash of oars being set, and the low calls of officers keeping men calm. Refugees on shore watched from behind rocks and trees, holding children close and listening for the first clash that would tell them whether they would ever see their homes again. The first light of morning showed the line of Greek ships in the straits, bows pointed toward open water, oars resting just above the surface. Rowers sat, packed in 3 levels, knees bent, hands on the grips, waiting for the call. Marines stood on deck with helmets on and shields close, holding spears and short weapons meant for close contact when ships locked together. The ships smelled of pitch, salt, sweat, and wet wood. Officers walked the narrow spaces between benches and spoke in low voices, checking that each man knew his role. Themistocles stood where he could be seen and heard, watching the water and the gaps between islands and headlands. He knew the channels. He knew the wind patterns that could shift a sail at the wrong moment. He also knew that many of the Persian ships had entered the straits during the night, tightening their formation in darkness and committing themselves to confined water. Across the mouth of the straits, the Persian fleet began to move in a wider mass. Persian commanders expected to use numbers to surround and crush the Greek line. The ships came forward in multiple squadrons, with Phoenician crews in many of the front positions and Ionian Greek crews mixed in other sections. Some vessels carried extra troops on deck, men meant to board once a Greek ship was pinned. The Persian ships also had rams, and their crews knew the basic mechanics of trireme combat. The difference in the straits came from space. A trireme needed room to gain speed, to turn, and to strike a target at an angle. A crowded channel reduced those options. When the Persian front ranks pushed inward, ships behind pressed forward and tightened the space even more. Oars bumped and tangled, bows drifted too close, captains shouted and tried to keep alignment. The Persian fleet still had strength and skill, yet the conditions began to work against its size. The Greeks began with a controlled advance. The front line rode forward in short bursts, then held position, keeping their rams aligned toward the enemy. A Greek trireme captain watched the distance and waited for a clear target. The goal was a clean ram to the side of an enemy hull, where wood would split and water would pour in. When the moment came, the Greek oarsmen pulled hard in unison and drove the ship forward. The bronze ram struck with a crack that carried across the water. The enemy ship lurched, and the men aboard stumbled, grabbing rails and each other to keep footing. As the Greek ship backed water to pull away, oars splashed, and the hull scraped free. A second Greek ship moved in to finish the damaged vessel or to strike another target while it struggled to maneuver. This pattern repeated across the narrow water, with multiple small clashes happening at once, each captain making decisions based on angle, speed, and the movement of nearby ships. The Persian plan depended on keeping formations and using numbers to envelop the Greeks. The straits forced the front of that plan into a tight knot. Ships collided with friendly ships. Some turned too sharply and exposed their sides. Greek captains watched for those mistakes and drove forward to exploit them. A ship that lost its oars on one side became hard to control. A ship that stalled became a barrier that blocked others. In several places, Persian vessels became packed together so tightly that they could not build speed for ramming. Greek ships had the same risk, yet their captains had chosen this water because they expected the crowding to harm the larger fleet more. The rowers felt the rhythm change as captains called for sudden bursts, sudden stops, and reverse strokes. Arms burned, shoulders cramped. Men kept pulling because the ship's survival depended on seconds. Xerxes watched from the shore where he could see a large part of the battle. He had chosen a position that allowed him to observe and to record. Scribes and attendants stayed near him. Bodyguards stood close, scanning the shoreline and the sea. Xerxes expected a clear victory. He expected the Greek line to collapse under pressure. Instead, he saw his front squadrons jammed and struck in quick sequences. He saw ships splinter and sink. He saw men in the water clinging to wreckage and trying to swim toward friendly vessels that struggled to avoid running them over. Persian crews fought back. Some Persian ships managed successful rams. Some boarded Greek triremes and turned the fight into a brutal struggle on decks slick with water and blood. Yet the overall movement in the straits began to favor the Greeks as Persian coordination frayed in the crowding. Individual actions stood out amid the chaos. Aeginetan ships worked the edges and struck Persian vessels trying to escape the main crush. Corinthian captains maneuvered in ways meant to draw opponents into collisions. Athenian crews pushed hard at the center, taking heavy risk because they had the largest stake in the outcome. Persian commanders tried to restore order, signaling with flags and shouted calls, yet the noise of battle swallowed many commands. A captain could hear the slap of oars, the crack of timbers, the scream of men falling into water, and the dull thump of shields as marines slammed into each other. One Persian commander, Artemisia of Halicarnassus, later became famous for a moment in the battle when she escaped pressure by ramming another ship in the confusion. The incident showed the desperation and split-second decision-making that happened when ships had limited room and captains needed a way out. As the battle wore on, the Persian fleet began to break into retreat in sections rather than as a single organized withdrawal. Some ships turned toward open water and tried to force their way out of the straits. Greek ships pursued and struck as they fled. Others tried to beach on nearby shores to save crews. Some Persian crews abandoned damaged ships and swam. Many drowned because heavy clothing and exhaustion made swimming difficult, and because the water filled with floating debris that caught limbs and pulled men down. Greek sailors also died, especially those thrown into the water without support from nearby ships. Yet the balance of losses favored the Greeks. The straits became a place where the Persian numbers turned into congestion, and congestion turned into targets. By late in the day, Persian commanders accepted that the battle could not be recovered. They pulled the remaining ships back towards safer anchorages. The Greek fleet held the straits and watched the Persian movement with caution, because a trap could still exist and because damaged Greek ships needed repairs. Greek crews bailed water from hulls, replaced broken oars, and tied splints around cracked timber to keep a ship afloat long enough to reach shore. On Salamis and nearby coasts, refugees watched the end of the battle and saw Persian ships pulling away from the narrow water. Some people cried. Some simply sat down and stared at the horizon, trying to process what they had seen. Greek commanders gathered and took stock of their ships and their dead. Themistocles listened to reports and watched the sea lanes, already thinking about what Xerxes would do next. Xerxes faced a practical problem. His army in Greece relied on supply routes that ran through the sea and through controlled coastal points. His bridge over the Hellespont also mattered, because it provided the main route back to Asia for the bulk of his forces. A defeat at sea did not destroy his land army, yet it changed the risk calculation. He could keep marching and occupy more Greek territory. He could also lose control of sea movement and face pressure on his lines. He chose to leave Greece with a large portion of his forces and return toward Asia, leaving a strong army behind under Mardonius to continue the campaign on land. The decision carried imperial logic. Xerxes preserved the core of his power and left a commander to attempt a finishing blow later. The war continued, and Greek leaders prepared for another season of fighting with the memory of Thermopylae still sharp, and with the outcome at Salamis giving them a reason to keep their cities in the alliance. Winter came with practical problems for both sides. Mardonius kept the Persian army in Greece with camps placed where food and shelter could be found, and he used envoys to probe Greek alliances. Some cities had already submitted, and some leaders weighed offers that included local control under Persian authority. Athens faced a second evacuation when Persian forces moved again into Attica because the city had already stripped itself for the fleet and had already scattered families across islands and the Peloponnese. People who had only recently returned to ruined streets gathered their bundles again and boarded boats again. Greek commanders argued over where to meet the Persian army on land, because a naval victory did not remove the need to stop the remaining invasion force. Spartan leaders arrived in force once the religious limits of the previous season passed, and once the alliance demanded a decisive land battle. Units gathered from across Greece, with hoplites in bronze and linen armor, and with light troops and attendants moving behind them with food and water. The armies met in Boeotia near Plataea, a place chosen because it offered room for hoplite formations and because Greek forces needed open ground to assemble their full strength. The Greeks set up camp with a defensive posture, keeping water sources and supply routes in mind. Persian troops formed across from them with a mix of infantry, cavalry, and allied contingents from regions under Persian influence. Mardonius relied heavily on cavalry to harass the Greeks and to disrupt their access to water, because cavalry could move faster than hoplites and could strike at vulnerable points. Skirmishing and probing attacks happened for days. Greek commanders adjusted their positions, shifting camps and moving units to protect springs and to keep their lines from being cut. The fighting turned sudden at moments, with arrows and javelins reaching into the Greek lines, and with hoplites stepping forward in short controlled advances to push cavalry back when it came too close. Both sides watched for weakness. Both sides waited for a mistake that would create a decisive opening. A turning point came when movement and confusion pulled parts of the Greek army away from their chosen ground. Orders traveled unevenly across a large camp, and darkness made coordination harder. Units moved at different times and in different directions, and some groups ended up separated. Mardonius saw the shift and committed to a full attack. Persian troops pressed forward with speed, aiming to break Greek cohesion before the hoplites could reform a unified line. The Greeks responded by forming blocks wherever they could, with Spartans taking a central role and other contingents forming near them. The clash became a hard, close fight as hoplites met Persian infantry and forced contact at spear length. Greek shields absorbed arrows at the start, then the spear work began again, steady and repetitive. Men pushed forward in compact lines, and the battle turned on which side held formation under pressure. Mardonius entered the fighting with his guard close, trying to drive his men forward and to exploit the disorder he believed he had created. He was killed during the battle, struck down in the crush where leaders had moved too close to the front. When the Persian commander fell, the effect spread through his army in a way that officers struggled to contain. Some units continued fighting hard. Others began to pull back toward their fortified camp. Greek forces pressed them, maintaining formation and pushing into the retreating mass. The Persian camp became the final point of resistance, with defenders trying to hold behind barriers, while Greek troops broke in through weak sections and forced the fight into enclosed spaces. By the end of the day, Persian resistance collapsed. The Persian army that had remained in Greece suffered a decisive defeat. Survivors scattered or withdrew towards safer routes, and Greek soldiers moved through the aftermath with the same practical tasks that followed every battle: collecting wounded, searching for missing men, and securing equipment. News of the land victory moved quickly, and it met other news from the Aegean. Greek ships and troops struck Persian forces again at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, where Persian ships and their supporting troops faced a Greek attack that turned into close fighting on shore. The combined effect of these victories changed the direction of the war. Persian forces withdrew from many positions in Greece, and the immediate threat of a full conquest receded. Greek cities faced the work of returning home, rebuilding, and deciding what kind of alliance would exist after shared danger. Athens began rebuilding walls and restoring public spaces, using the labor and money it could gather and using its fleet as leverage. Sparta returned to its own priorities in the Peloponnese, guarding its social system and its influence. Rivalries that had been paused during invasion returned with time, because cities still had competing interests and because victory created new questions about leadership and power. Thermopylae remained a fixed point in memory and in politics because the details were clear and easy to repeat. A narrow pass, a small defending force, a king who stayed. The fact that the defenders included many Greeks beyond the Spartans mattered to those who knew the roster, and the Thespians carried a particular weight because they stayed with Leonidas to the end. The 300 Spartans became the most famous number because it was compact and because it fit Spartan reputation. Yet the defense began with thousands of Greeks, and Helot attendants stood close behind the Spartan line through much of the fighting. The Persian victory at the pass also did not end the war, and Greek leaders used the delay and the example to keep cities committed long enough for the fleet and the larger land army to do their work later. The story also kept its human details, including the men who survived the final stand for reasons that people could name. Aristodemus left the pass with an eye infection and orders to recover, and he returned to Sparta alive while his companions were dead. He faced harsh treatment at home, and he later fought at Plataea with intense aggression. Another Spartan, Pantites, had been sent on a message and returned after the battle to find the outcome already decided. These details stayed in the background of popular retellings, yet they mattered in Sparta because they showed how the city enforced its standards and how survival could carry consequences. The betrayal by Ephialtes also became part of the record in a direct way. Greek writers preserved his name and attached it to the mountain path, and his act became a warning repeated in political arguments and moral lessons. Later reports describe his death at the hands of a local man, and Greek communities treated that killing as a form of justice, even when the immediate motive involved other disputes. The landscape itself held the memory as well, because the pass remained a traveled route and people could point to the hot springs and the constricted ground where the fighting happened. Memorials were raised, including a stone inscription associated with the Spartans that gave a simple instruction to the traveler to report their obedience to Spartan law. The commemoration did not require elaborate language. A passerby could see the place, imagine the wall, and grasp the scale of the decision made there. The longer legacy grew from repetition and from the usefulness of the example. Greek leaders cited Thermopylae when they needed to argue for endurance under pressure. Later generations used it as a model of disciplined defense in a confined space. The facts that survived through writers like Herodotus provided the structure, even when numbers and speeches carried exaggeration shaped by storytelling and by the limits of sources. The core sequence stayed consistent. Xerxes advanced with a vast force. The Greeks chose a narrow choke point. The defense held for days. A mountain path was used to flank the position, and Leonidas and a group of allies stayed behind and died in close combat. The story lived because it could be told in a straight line from road to wall to final stand, and because it showed how a small group could slow a much larger army long enough for a wider coalition to organize and win later battles.